Hello and welcome to Painted for Combat, where recently we have been putting together an awesome space for playing and filming Dungeons & Dragons. Today we're adding to that space with some incredible functional props, specifically making some epoxy resin healing potions for my players to use at the table. But before we do dive into that final activity of today's project, we first need to run some tests. And let's just say epoxy resin is no walk in the park. For this project I thought that picking up the cheapest resin I could find would suffice. This was a pretty simple resin pour after all. But before jumping right in and possibly ruining some of the only bottles I had, I first decided to run a couple of tests. For the very first test, I want to try and make a spilled healing potion. Just a cool fun prop that can sit on a shelf and look like someone knocked over one of the healing potions we're going to make. A pretty simple first project that honestly doesn't really matter so much if it doesn't work quite right. Following the instructions, I went ahead and mixed up the resin 1-to-1 and gave it a good stir. But the kit that I picked up didn't actually come with a red resin dye, so we'll have to settle with some Army Painter speed paint to achieve the rich red we want. And I'm hoping that this doesn't mess with the resin too much. I also took this as an opportunity to try out adding some glitter to the mix, to get a more sparkling brew. And then got to pouring this into our bottle. Using some poster tack to hold the bottle in place while pouring the rest of the resin onto some wax paper. And for good measure, to sell this as a healing potion, I added a few red D4s to the pour. I picked these up in bulk a few years ago. I think I have something like 100 of them that I do not need all of for playing TTRPGs, so sacrificing a few to an interesting project like this seemed like an okay idea. While our spilled potion is curing, I also want to run an additional test, just to see how easy epoxy resin actually is to work with. So I picked up a few cheap dice molds, just to have a play. I mixed up a batch of resin, leaving it pure, no dye, no additions, so that I could get a controlled idea of how dice casting might work with the resin I had. I poured it in gently and used a torch to try and pop some of the bubbles that came to the surface. And after putting the lid on, I weighed it down evenly with my air compressor and left that to cure as well. I made sure to leave both of these on the windowsill, so that they'd get a good amount of sunlight and so that any fumes caused by them curing would be ventilated outside. This resin stated a 24-hour cure time, but I made sure to leave it for closer to 32 just to be safe. And while our spilled potion did spread out a little more than anticipated, it looked relatively successful, even if it's a little bendy and not exactly rock hard. And I figured that this could be due to any number of factors: the heat while curing, the curing time, or the depth of the pour. So while it wasn't perfect, it did have me hopeful for the dice. And oh, how wrong I was. I don't know if I didn't mix this resin well enough, had it somewhere too hot or too cold, or somehow messed up the ratios, but this did not work. Some of the dice were mostly cured, but had a sticky top layer that refused to cure properly, and overall these dice were super soft. A couple of them were even straight up still liquid resin. So this batch of dice and the mold were a complete write-off. But every failed project is a learning opportunity, so I took to the internet to see if I could figure out what went wrong. Both with the minor hiccups of our spilled potion prop, but also with the major screw-ups of the dice. Turns out, resin is very picky. Having the correct temperature for the resin to cure at is essential, and the studio here has been pretty cold while I've been working on this project, so that is very likely one of the issues we ran into. But as I suspected, it also could have been the depth of the potion spill wasn't actually enough to cure fully, so those are two things that I need to be careful of. Secondly, I learned that there are, unsurprisingly, different kinds of resin, and with different hardnesses within those types. Some resins are designed to remain flexible, to be used more as a coating over other art mediums, while some resins are designed to cure fully hard. Moving forward, I went ahead and picked up a proper art resin, with a hardness rating of 80, which is the sweet spot for things like dice. And it also lists a more specific mixing ratio of 3-to-1 measured by weight, which should hopefully set us up for more success in the next tests. To test out this resin, I wanted to do another dice pour, but also wanted to test a deeper pour in a bottle of similar size to our potions. This resin had a max pour depth listed at 2 centimeters, and I was looking to do a bit deeper than that in the final potions. My hope is that because our final pours will be in bottles that are only so wide, that extra depth won't be too much of a problem, but that's why we run tests. I mixed up enough resin to achieve the depth I wanted in the bottle, with some extra that I would use to pour into as many of the dice molds as I could with the leftover. I went for a pretty deep pour in the bottle and filled up about 4 of the dice. Now that I knew that I needed to leave these curing at somewhere between 20 and 25 degrees Celsius, I placed them on top of my 3D printer's build plate, and I set that to 24 degrees, which I was hoping would keep the entire pour somewhere within that sweet spot. This also had the added benefit that I could turn on my extractor fan and ventilate the resin even better. This resin specifically listed a demolding time of 12 hours and a full cure time of 48, so I made sure to leave it for a good 24 hours just to be safe before taking a look. At this point, the resin in our bottle is still a little bit flexible, which is hopefully just because it's not quite fully cured yet, and with some luck this will achieve full hardness in another 24 hours. So I'll go ahead and put this back on the heat, and then we'll take a look at our dice. Speaking of 3D printers, if you're involved in the tabletop hobby and have an interest or own a 3D printer, consider checking out the Painted for Combat Patreon, where for just a couple of bucks you can get access to an awesome community Discord surrounding 3D printing for the tabletop, as well as pick up my 3D printer profiles and other tools. Or at the higher tiers, get access to our monthly STL Bases release, like our release for April, the Shattered Shale. These are a set of great, generic ruined bases, where shale tile have been flung into dirty earth. So whether your miniatures are a set of townsfolk fleeing a ruined village, or marines setting foot in a destroyed city, these bases will fit perfectly. And as always, the Shattered Shale bases have been sculpted to print support-free on FDM printers. So whether you want to jump into an awesome community, pick up our monthly STL Bases release, or just help support the channel, consider checking out the Patreon with the links below. These are looking much more successful. Even though they aren't at full hardness yet, they are at least cured. No sticky, uncured residue or fully liquid dice. But they do still have their issues. A ton of bubbles and very uneven top surfaces. I think what I need to do for our final pour is overfill the molds a little more than I did, and then leave them for as long as their working time will allow, so that all of those bubbles can come to the surface, and I can pop them before putting the lid on. But I do think we're onto something, so I'll give these another day or so to cure, and then we can take a proper look at them then. Another 24 hours and the potion bottle is cured perfectly, as you would expect from resin, right down to an almost glassy sound when you tap the surface. And these dice are feeling much more rigid. If the pour itself had been a tad more successful, these would be ready to roll. So I think that what comes next is our final attempt at a dice pour, using all of the lessons we've learned so far, and then using that as our final test before moving on to the big ticket item, the healing potion bottles. For this final set of dice, I want to try and make something I could use at the table if I wanted. So we'll add a bit more colour and some glitter to the final batch to try and make something interesting enough to be worthy of rolling at the table. So we'll go ahead and mix up our resin, making sure to give it a good 3 minutes or so of stirring, then adding in our purple dye and a sprinkle of gold glitter. Giving it one final gentle mix so that we don't add a ton of bubbles, and then pouring this into our mold. I tried to fill each dice about 30% of the way, hit it with a torch to remove as many bubbles as possible, pour some more, pop the bubbles again, and so on, until the mold was filled past the top, so that there was enough resin to fill the dice once the lid of the mold was on. At this stage, I used another trick I saw during my research, using a skewer to make sure the resin is pushed into all of the corners of the mold, and pulling up the edges of the dice to try and remove any big bubbles stuck on those corners. Then I gave the table a good few taps to try and shake any bubbles closer to the top. At this point, I left the mold uncapped until the last few minutes of its working time to let those bubbles all rise to the surface, hitting them one more time with the torch. Then it was over to the 3D printing build plate, preheated to 24 degrees, capped off, weighed down, and left to cure for a full 72 hours. Even as I peel away the residue around the mold, this is feeling so much better. And removing the top, these look awesome. We do still have a couple of small bubbles that made their way into the surface of a couple of dice, but I don't think that is something you can reliably avoid without a full-on pressure pot and fancy equipment. So I'm pretty happy with the minimal bubbles we are seeing. The main issue with this set, and I'm not sure if this is because I let them cure fully in the mold, was that some of the dice had fused with the silicone mold in some areas. This unfortunately meant that I had to cut them free in some places. So this will be our last dice pour no matter what, as this mold isn't going to be up to scratch for another pour, and I do not have a third one lying around. We can also see that a lot of the glitter has settled in the bottom of our mold, which is good to know before making our final potions. But even with a few flaws, I think that once they're cleaned up, these dice are going to look awesome. And I think that we'll leave painting in the numbers on these dice until we get to the final reveals at the end of the video, and for now, shift our attention to the final part of our project, the Healing Potion Resin Pours. And using everything that we've learned so far, I think we can make these look exactly how I'm imagining them. To start, I measured how much resin I would need to fill all 3 bottles as much as I wanted using water, and after making sure they were fully dry, got to mixing the resin. A 3:1 ratio followed by 4 minutes of gentle stirring, adding in enough red speed paint to get the rich red we want, before adding in a mix of silver and red glitter, which I made sure to add only in the last 5 minutes of our resin's working time so that it hopefully got a little better suspended in the mixture, giving all of that one final gentle stir before pouring into each of the bottles. And one last step of giving each bottle a good tap on the desk to pull those few bubbles we did make to the top, before hitting them one last time with the torch. And once again, these were off for another 72-hour cure. And now, finally, after a week of trial and error, big failures and small successes, all working towards what will hopefully be a successful trio of healing potions, and a set of handmade dice to boot, here are the final results. This was quite the journey and a learning experience. Resin is awesome, but it is not easy. And I'm very glad that I didn't start with the final bottles, because I absolutely would have ruined them. Epoxy resin is an awesome medium for its specific use cases, but I do not think that it will become a frequent part of my hobby. Because aside from the fact that you need to be super safe while using this stuff, it's also never a guarantee that it's going to work quite right, unless you have all of the fancy equipment and a ton of experience. But these healing potions will hopefully be a lifelong addition to my table, and now I can say that I've handmade my own set of dice, which to me is pretty damn cool. If you like what you're seeing here, these healing potions are actually one of the final additions to my new D&D space, where my friends and I will soon be filming our brand new campaign. So whether you want to see these potions in action, or just love D&D in general, consider heading over and subscribing to Roll for Adventure. We are in the process of a major upgrade to that channel, and trailers will be dropping very soon for our next campaign in that new space. So if you love D&D, I promise you'll want to be there when those start dropping. Do be sure to like if you liked, subscribe for more fun projects surrounding the tabletop hobby, but most importantly, thank you so much for watching. And as always, have a good one.